around the council. I must have had a moment of weakness when I admitted to a canvasser that I was a Lib Dem voter, because one day my local councillor, Wendy Marchant, appeared at my door clutching what I now know was a membership pad. I'd always thought that joining a political party was an activity for intellectuals, but actually I was too embarrassed to say no to her. In any event, it was only a £5, so I signed up. And of course, had absolutely no intention whatsoever of ever being active in the party. 4 months later, I was a candidate. And within 6 months, I was on the district council. Now, I have to admit that at the time, I'd never thought of myself as having a particularly specific political philosophy, just a very strong sense of fairness. I was brought up as a forces child, and I always resented the system of rank, which I thought was taken to absurd levels. As a child in Singapore, when I went swimming, I couldn't change with my friends. We had to use separate changing rooms because our dads were different ranks. And as a forces child, I'd moved around with my family and moved so many more times than I could care to remember, that I really appreciated the sense of belonging to a settled community. And I grew to realise that genuine community doesn't just happen, people make it happen. And as time went on, I realised that the philosophy of the Liberal Democrats chimed with the instincts I've had all my life. And as Paddy Ashdown said, when he discovered liberalism, he found that it fitted like an old overcoat. It remains as necessary to our troubled world today. 5 reasons for us to carry on delivering those leaflets and knocking on those doors. 200 years ago, in 1809, one great man died and another was born. The one who died was Thomas Paine, an ordinary journalist who wrote extraordinary books. In an age before democracy or rights, and in an age of autocracy and tradition, he argued that reason and utility should be our guiding principles. And in an age of inequality, he argued for redistributive taxation to ensure the poor their rights to the common property of the human race. He was fearless in his condemnation of injustice. The principles which he set out formed the basis of the great radical tradition on which the Liberal Party came to be founded. But it was the man born in 1809 who was, more than any other, responsible for establishing the Liberal Party as the natural party of government in the Victorian era. William Ewart Gladstone began his political life as a Tory. And he later said, "I was brought up to distrust and dislike liberty." Gladstone became a Liberal. He fought for political reform. He fought for political reform throughout his long life and led his last government at the age of 82. He was the first politician to take politics out to ordinary people, and they loved him for it. They called him the People's William. He could speak to them for 2 hours or even longer, and he held them spellbound. Nick, you're a great speaker, but don't even think about it. Many of you will know Gladstone's words carved below his bust in the National Liberal Club. Liberalism is trust of the people qualified only by prudence. Conservatism is distrust of the people only qualified by fear. And how that resonates today. He could have been talking about ID cards or the assaults on civil liberties launched by the current government with the enthusiastic backing of the Tory party. And there's another theme of Gladstone's career with which I personally identify very strongly. Gladstone was a great internationalist. He supported free trade, not just to create wealth, but to build stronger links between people of the world and to make conflict less likely. As a teenager, I lived on an Air Force base in Germany at the height of the Cold War. And each day as I passed through the gates, I saw a large sign which said, "Your task in peace is to prepare for war and never forget it." It was evident to me then, as it is now, that strengthening international institutions of all kinds as a way of building peace and security was the way. And as an internationalist, Gladstone was a stalwart defender of the rights of underdogs and minorities across the world. And his sentiments resonate today, even if the language sounds outdated. He urged people to remember the rights of the savage. He spoke of the sanctity of life in the hill villages of Afghanistan and about the unity of humanity unbounded by religion. A few weeks ago in London, my friend and colleague Eric Avebury was awarded the Liberal International Prize for Freedom. It's a recognition of Eric's half a century of being a champion of oppressed minorities at home and across the globe. And remember how Paddy spoke up to defend the rights of Hong Kong citizens to settle here, even when the tabloids were vitriolic in their opposition. How Charles spoke out about invading Iraq when he was a lone voice in Parliament, and that Nick was the only leader to speak out against the attacks on Gaza earlier this year. Time and time again, Liberal Democrats have championed a cause, not because it'll win votes, but because it's right. We've defended minorities and we've stood up for civil liberties when public opinion has been against us. And the spirit of Gladstone lives on. And there's more that we can remember Gladstone for. For him, politics wasn't a matter of narrow calculation, of self-serving promises to vested interests. Politics was a matter of great moral causes, of questions of right and wrong. And in our world of focus groups and opinion polling and target letters, sometimes we can forget that people still respond to the appeal of principle, of politicians doing things just because they're right. And it saddens me when politicians get vilified by voters, and of course there's some who deserve it. The old expenses system in Parliament was rotten, and there were some who abused it shockingly. But the majority of MPs of all parties, and I would say without exception Liberal Democrats, aren't in it for the money. And in this cynical age, people often forget that the only reason we have a functioning democracy in this country is because of the work done by thousands of volunteers like you. 50 years after Gladstone was born, two more key events in Liberal history took place. In a meeting in June 1859 in St James's, just across the park from the House of Commons, three parliamentary factions came together in what were known as Willis's Rooms. Actually, I knew Phil had been around a while. I didn't know it had been that long. Three groups were there: Radicals, Whigs, and the free trade followers of the former Prime Minister Robert Peel. And each contributed a distinctive strand to British liberalism. The Radicals were pressing for reform. They were impatient with the established order. They wanted social and political justice. And the Whigs were the historic defenders of freedom of religion and thought, of the rights of Parliament against the monarch. And the Peelites were the champions of free trade and a sound economy. And together, these three groups created a liberal political force which was to govern Britain for most of the following 60 years, a party which proved to be far more effective at beating the Conservatives than Labour ever managed. And what brought them together was a decision of the Tory government over the issue of Italian unification. What they wanted to do was to defend the rights of oppressed minorities and nations to be free of imperial rule, fundamentally the same stance that our party took over Bosnia and Iraq. So a defining principle of liberalism has always been our belief in just international order, in freedom, security, and prosperity for all nations, all individuals. And that same year, 1859, John Stuart Mill, that giant of Victorian liberal philosophers, published his greatest work on liberty. And that book sets out with powerful clarity our core belief in the rights of the individual. Generations of liberals have used Mill's arguments to defend freedom of speech, conscience, and thought, and the importance of originality and dissent. On liberty is the foundation stone of the freedom for which this party fights, and that's why it's the symbol of the party's presidency, and I'm so proud to be its guardian during my term of office. Liberalism is a dynamic philosophy. It evolves to suit changing circumstances. By the end of the 19th century, it was obvious that freedom by itself would never be enough. You can't be free if you're shackled by poverty or unemployment or ill health. And so was born the new liberalism of the 20th century, the social liberalism of Asquith and Lloyd George, a strand of thinking which led to that great liberal William Beveridge and his assault on the five giants: want, ignorance, disease, squalor, and idleness. And this, close to the ideas of the founders of the SDP, who helped to make us into such a strong force later that century. On the 5th of the anniversaries I've talked about, 100 years ago, Lloyd George published his People's Budget, the most radical reform of public finances this country has ever seen. And tax policy, for the first time, was used for social ends to redistribute income from rich to poor. And that, of course, is why the Tories opposed it so viciously. It struck at the heart of privilege and elitism that lay at the bottom of everything they stand for. And they still do. I mean, where is Eric Pickles coming from? Suggesting that the Tories are the voice of progressive politics and a home for liberal values, when their sole specific pledge is the abolition of inheritance tax, the party which has allied itself to a group of right-wing xenophobes in the European Parliament. There's only one Eric I feel at home with. So, what an amazing year 2009 is. 200 years since the death of Paine and the birth of Gladstone, 150 since the foundation of the Liberal Party and the publication of On Liberty, 100 since the People's Budget. The great historic record of liberal causes and liberal triumphs is arrayed before us. The fight for liberty, the assault on privilege, the defence of the individual, belief in internationalism, the struggle for social justice. So remember them when you have a drink in the bar tonight. Remember them when you put your focus through the door next week. And remember them because those fights are not over. Poverty, ignorance and conformity still blight the lives of too many people. Remember them because Britain is still not the free, fair and green country that we know it can be. Those liberals who went before us showed us the way. Now we must take pride in their record and live up to it. Thank you.